This podcast is sponsored by the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. You can learn more about the work of the Institute and other podcasts that are available by going to the website www.rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org. Rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org, as if rediscovering psychoanalysis is one word. This particular podcast is titled The Impression of the Past Upon the Present. And the purpose of these podcasts is to explore some important ideas that come from psychoanalytic experience without getting into laborious and often unnecessary jargon. The ambition is to explore such ideas, some of which are quite unfamiliar, but very relevant for practitioners, but also to do so in a manner that is understandable and intriguing for those outside the field. Now, this podcast's topic, how the past impresses itself upon the present, is obviously impossibly large. So I'm going to approach it from an existential standpoint, sketching and selecting for our attention some of those psychoanalytic and psychodynamic processes that significantly impact our lived experience, how we think about ourselves and how we conduct our lives. I think you'll find that psychoanalytic thinking advances some quite disconcerting and provocative propositions on this topic. I have to begin with a brief reflection, a brief preamble as it were, on three pivotal notions. Those of the past, of temporality, or rather temporalities in the plural, and of the present. So let's begin with the notion of the past, the idea of the past. We have to face it, we don't have any direct access to the past. Yet, almost all of us doggedly believe in its quondam or erstwhile reality. There really was a past. But it is, by definition, not existent in the present. And we're quite desperate to believe that it was indeed indicative and actual. And I will shortly suggest why this is so important to us. This is an instance of what I am calling a sort of quondam or erstwhile realism. Although most of us have played with the idea that the present might just be a dream, from which we might at any moment awaken, no doubt to find that we are actually royalty on some other planet. This is what psychoanalysts call a family romance fantasy. But by and large, we strongly prefer to believe that we are now living in a here and now reality that was preceded by its own past there and then reality. However, we cannot get around the fact that the past is past. It no longer exists. Thus, we trade only in stories about it. The past is insistently but variously represented by us in the here and now, in the present. And since stories are always, in some germinal sense, constructions, the past is inevitably malleable. By this, I do not mean that all stories should be treated as if having equal validity. There's no reason to believe that the Egyptian pyramids could be seen last week in downtown Harare, let alone to act on such a thought. And I'm certainly not legitimizing the abhorrent spectre of Holocaust denialism. Although this abhorrent phenomenon does illustrate, painfully, how much false beliefs and patent fantasies can mobilize hatred. But the constructions of the past do depend, to a rather unsettling degree, on our belief in them, and the credence we give to some and not others is perhaps, sadly, never wholly rational. Now, about this, psychoanalysis has much to say, as we shall see. Let's go now to the second pivotal notion of temporality. Here are some quick thoughts about time, which has been the subject of philosophical speculation in the Eurocentric tradition from Aristotle to Henri Bergson and through the past 100 years. Almost all indigenous cultures, including the mainstream of Africa and Asia, have a quite different sense of the matter, but that's an issue to be taken up on another occasion. Towards the end of the 18th century, Immanuel Kant pointed out that time is invisible to us and can only be thought about in terms of space. Yet many of us tend to believe in it abstractly, as what Isaac Newton in his 1687 Principia described as a singular, homogeneous, equable and irreversible flow. But nothing in our lived experience can verify this. Time might not be linear, as Friedrich Nietzsche suggested with his doctrine of eternal recurrence, and as indeed most non-Euromodern traditions believe. In 1908, John Ellis MacTaggart, a distinguished British philosopher, wrote a famous paper on the unreality of time, pointing out the contradictions between what could come to be called the A series and the B series. Now, the B series is cosmological. Time is a sequence. Time 35, time 36, time 37, and so forth. And that's all that can be verified scientifically in terms of the second law of thermodynamics. That's all that makes sense outside the human mind. The idea of the present makes no sense to a physicist. The A series, by contrast, is phenomenological, and it pivots on the experience of a subject, the I that accompanies this thought and your next thought and your next one. This is actually what I will call an I now is that is inherent to consciousness as representational. So the now is very much a product of consciousness, and it divides time into past, present, and future. The brilliant French psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva argues that this sort of time, phenomenological time, depends on this positioning of our subjective I within the symbolic order. And at least partially, she's correct. So now let us turn to the experience of the present, the third pivotal notion in this preamble. If the reality of the presentness of the present is attested by our lived experience of this experiential I now is, and I argued this in my 1993 book, then three things need to be noted. The first point to be noted is that this now is remarkably elusive. We have to face what has been called the spectrality of presence, the indescribable transience of the present. As George Hegel discussed it in his 1807 Critique of Immediacy, as soon as you grasp it, it is gone. Just over a century later, Edmund Husserl tried to offer a phenomenological analysis of what he called the inner time consciousness. And the idea was that he would somehow secure the egological certainty of the experience of immediacy. That is, effectively show that the now is not empty. His rather awkward and speculative contribution, that's my evaluation, is that every now, and remember this is also about the emptiness of the I of subjectivity, every now is supported by retentional and protensional tonalities, for want of a better word. Generally, and in my opinion, this has not been found to be very convincing. So we're now left with a disquieting experience in which we find that the now and the I, on which our sense of existence depends, both vanish as soon as we try to pin them down. The more we think about it, the more the presentness of our presence is like the Cheshire cat, always fading out of our grasp. To quote Karl Marx's famous aphorism, rather illegitimately, to quote it, all that is solid seems to melt into air. Here's the second point about the present. What we feel we know, with greater certainty, is that we can indicate the now that once was. This is our erstwhile realism. That is, we cannot secure the present moment, but in another moment we will be able to represent it. A representation that we do not author, but emerges in a form structured by the law and order of representationality. What has come to be called by most psychoanalysts the symbolic order. And this was the point that Julia Kristeva argued quite forcefully. What we know with greater certainty is that the present moment leaves a reflection or a trace only as the represent, a representation that is structured according to a law and order of representationality that isn't of our making. We really do not like to entertain just how dependent our lived experience is upon the semiotic structuring provided us by language, or by the symbolic order of representationality. Countering the vapid optimism of René Descartes, what prevailing currents in the human sciences of the 20th century have shown, very much in line with Freud's discovery of the deceptive character of our self-consciousness, is the subjectivity of our I and our now is remarkably fragile, unstable and always mobile, tossed about by forces outside itself, the forces of the symbolic order by which we come into being as beings in the world, being at least a major nomination for such a force. This is surely why, failing to ensure the reality of I as subject, we fall back on the construction of extensive systems of self-representation, representations of me, almost all of which refer to something that was there and then. We cling to these as real, and indeed perhaps we need to do this for the sake of what is called our mental health. The me is engaged in compulsively repetitious performances of self-representation. Barnaby is a psychoanalyst, Barnaby is a nomad, Barnaby once tried to play the bagpipes and failed dismally but comically, Barnaby is on a crazy mission to try to bring the discipline of psychoanalysis back to its senses, Barnaby has lived in Asia, all that sort of thing. Isn't it interesting that so much of what psychologists have called our self-system actually refers to events that we understand to be past? Perhaps especially interesting since psychoanalysis powerfully demonstrates how much of what we think is our past was not actually the way it was. How much do we live in the present? If I asked any of you who are listening to this podcast, who are you and why? Most of us would produce an answer that references the represented past. I was born in Berkshire, or I became a psychologist out of my own desperation, or whatever. Few of us, I think, would immediately come up with something like, I'm now feeling the pressure of my chair against my bottom. But even if you did, notice how much of the response still involves representations of past events, your knowledge of chairs, bottoms, etc. And notice also how the response is directed towards a future. I should shift my bum in order to feel more comfortable. As Freud's philosophy teacher, Franz Brentano, argued, all thought is inherently intentional, which sort of means directed to a future. As an aside, it's interesting to note how much, instead of living in the present, we are drawn to live both in an imagined future and in a sort of future-perfect tense. The latter is living in this present which will be past at some future juncture, as it will have been. Think here of the tyranny of the cell phone giving us a seemingly infinite ability to take selfies, recording the present moment instead of living it more fully, for a future in which the person may or may not look at this artifact in order to assure her or himself that it actually happened, even though they did not live it fully at the time. It's as if living in some tenuous future perfect tense, a present that will be the past in the future. In short, the quality of the present that we're examining here is one aspect of why Emmanuel Levinas, the Lithuanian French philosopher who died in 1995, described how what we think of as our present is an ongoing precipitation of a litany of past futures. That's my characterization of one aspect of what Levinas contributed, and we'll soon return to this point. But here's the third point to note here about the present. Given the fragility and mobility of the I of the subject, it's not surprising that we build our lives with a multiplicity of self-representations, a system of me representations that I just illustrated when I said Barnaby this, Barnaby that. Yet even with the self-situating function of a repetitive system of me representations, it's conspicuous how much so many of us feel the need to crowd our lives with memorabilia. How much do we treasure the scarf our grandmother used to wear? A pressed flower sent to us by our first lover? A painting our child did in kindergarten? In my professional and personal experience, it's a very rare person who does not hold dearly to at least a few such possessions. In psychoanalytic terminology, they are not so much transitional objects like your teddy bear or your blankie once were. Rather, they are what the Cypriot psychoanalyst Vamick Vulcan called linking objects. Essentially, they serve not only to shore up our wobbly memories, and our memories are always wobbly, as we shall see, but also to reassure us that our memories did actually happen, that there indeed was an erstwhile reality. Yet both of those functions are patently unrealistic. However, the importance such objects have for many of us is not only disproportionate but marginally delusional. Yes, they shore up our wobbly memories. Yes, they reassure us that these memories did actually happen. And we need to treasure these things, even though they are marginally delusional. We treasure them often for dear life. Think of the man who dives into a burning building to rescue a photo album that has the only remaining pictures of his East European grandparents. Yet it may well be an album that he would never have opened again had there not been a fire. He simply needs to know that he has it. I hope all of this preamble has not left you gasping, because it has been necessary to what is to come. I have now to introduce two central features of our inner life of representations: historicity and historicality. Let us start with historicity. It means simply the way one representation builds upon its predecessors. We might call it development, but I want to retain a special word for it, and I think you'll see why. Historicality indicates the way in which we seem to label our representations in terms of the time frame to which their referent refers. Why not just call it memory? Again, I'm hoping that in a moment you will shortly see why this is not just gratuitous jargonizing. Both notions might seem comparatively obvious, but psychoanalysis has shown them to be counterintuitively complex. Let's start with the historicity of our inner theatre of representations. Simply put, we're not capable of producing a representation de novo. The representation of new experiences builds on the representation of previous experiences. That's Developmental Psychology 101. Jean Piaget elegantly described how we adapt to a new experience by assimilating it to an already established representation, and simultaneously the pre-existing representation accommodates to the novelty, and thus the representational repertoire is expanded. Let me offer a somewhat corny example from my early adult encounter with orangutan. The orangutan is, as you may know, the Southeast Asian hairy fruit. When I encountered it first, I assumed it was a lychee. Lychees or lychees had been a particularly delicious treat growing up in the United Kingdom's so-called austerity years. But orangutans are different, and I didn't encounter one until early adulthood, and gradually, only gradually after much empirical investigation, by which I mean I bought some and ate them, could I now describe to you the significant differences between these two species of soapberry animal. Orangutans are generally bigger, with more orange-colored skin that has greenish hairs, and the taste of their flesh is creamier. My representations of the novel necessarily built upon pre-existing representation of lychees. That's historicity. Now let us turn to the historicality of a representation. This is the way in which it is as if every representation we have is tagged with a label. Distant past, recent past, now, this is a tricky one as I've already indicated, or future. You have representations of yourself hoping to enjoy a good night's sleep later tonight. This is future, yes? You have representations of yourself enjoying or not this talk. This is present, yes? Then you have representations of the meal that you hopefully enjoyed prior to listening to this podcast. This is recent past, yes? Maybe you have representations of the dinner with which you celebrated your last decadal birthday. This is more distant past, yes? But how did you know where to position these representations on a timeline that is itself, in a sense that must be taken very seriously, purely a fiction within you? At least part of the answer is that it is as if we have a complex tagging mechanism that indicates somehow when each represented event occurred. Our existential confidence in this one, for want of a better word, I'm calling a tagging mechanism, is precisely what psychoanalysis has more or less entirely subverted. Let me put it this way. Psychoanalysis has decisively shown that we do not remember any event as it actually happened, and that the reasons we remember anything are not the reasons, or at least not the only reasons, we remember anything about the event. Psychoanalytic wisdom has thus put the kibosh on the most basic aspects of our functioning in everyday life. Experimental and cognitive psychology has definitively supported psychoanalysis in much of this by demonstrating that what we remember is actually not the original event, but only the last iteration of what we remember of the event. We never remember events as they actually happened. Rather, what we remember is closer to what we remembered the last time we remembered these events. As if the mind operates on the principle of remember, remembering, remembering, remembering. And moreover, as we shall soon see, psychoanalysis has then made the issue even more complex by showing how our unconscious desires distort even these reiterative processes. What psychoanalytic findings suggest is that desires and our conflicts around them may modify every transition from one instantiation of a memory to its next reiteration. My next comment is actually parenthetical but distinctly relevant. There's a debate today within the United States judiciary as to whether eyewitness testimony has any value at all. One person says, The bank clerk raised his hands even before the bank robber had pulled out his gun. No, 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 says another witness. The shots were fired at the ceiling even before we realized we were being robbed. You get the point. Not just minor details, but quite major aspects of the event and its sequencing are quickly subjected to distortions of this type. So let's talk about distortions. For want of a better word, distortions. In 1899, Sigmund Freud published the first paper on what he called screen memories. Although it's now the classic essay on the topic, the screen memory it discusses is actually atypical. In summary, an adult man recalls a childhood scene in which, as a 7 or 8-year-old, he and his friend, in a bit of childhood rough and tumble, bowled over a pretty young girl, causing her both to drop the flowers that she had been picking and to start to cry. What is discovered through diligent psychoanalytic interrogation, which we can't go into right now, is that the reason the man suddenly remembered this incident from his childhood is because he currently is struggling with ongoing but conflictual desires to deflower a young lady he had just met of his own age. Note that it is not suggested that the events of childhood did not actually happen. Who knows whether they did or not? The human capacity to fictionalize and then believe in the reality of the fiction is truly impressive. But what is suggested is that the remembering is prompted by currently conflictual desires that are more or less extraneous, on the surface at least, to the events depicted. The semiotic relationship between the remembered event and the wished-for scenario is one of condensations and displacements. Deflower, I caused the little girl to drop her bouquet, and deflower, I wish to relieve a young woman that I've just met of her virginity, and so forth. This is not the more typical mode with which screen memories operate. As a clinical psychoanalyst, it's much more common to find that an event may be remembered in distorted ways that point to a conflict that, it can be inferred, was happening at the time and is now being reworked in the course of a treatment. For example, one of my patients, back in my Detroit days, had a clear visual memory that seemed to be from early childhood. He's standing at a window, holding his mother's leg, while she looks out at the distance, seeming wistful and sad. This is how he feels he remembers her. It's summer, and she's wearing a light yellow dress with bare legs. But strangely, the most graphically vivid part of the memory is that the curtains pulled back around the window are billowing in the wind. I cannot take you through all that transpired in the course of this man's psychoanalytic treatment around this memory, but suffice it to say that the billowing curtains seemed to represent his mother's dress, which was, of course, billowing because she was pregnant, subsequently to miscarry. The derivations operative in such memories comprise multiple condensations and displacements, too complex to discuss further here, but hopefully you understand the point I'm making. What I want to leave you with is that psychoanalytic experience suggests that all our memories are, to some degree or other, screens for ideas and wishes that are other and otherwise than what appears to be represented in the memory. My late friend, Jim Grotstein, who was a trainee of Wilfred Bion, I believe, told me of a patient who, a few years into his psychoanalysis, fell into a deep depression. In the course of his intense despair, he retrieved a memory. In the memory, he's a young boy standing in the second floor of his parents' apartment, and in front of him is his younger brother, looking out of an open window. In the memory, He clearly sees himself running across the room and pushing his brother out of the window. The brother's fall is somewhat broken by the awning of the shop below the apartment, but nevertheless the brother is seriously injured and dies. So far, so good, so to speak. Surely such an event and the new recollection of it is a recipe for terrible depression based on horrendous guilt. This man had, after all, committed fratricide. However, as it happened, sometime later during the psychoanalytic treatment, this patient's elderly father came to visit him, and for the first time the patient confesses to his father his heinous crime, telling his father that the brother did not just fall out of the window but was pushed. "Nonsense," says the old man. "Your brother got meningitis, was hospitalized and died 3 days later." And yet, here is this man, as an adult patient in treatment with Jim Gottstein, undergoing a most serious period of depression. What if we entertain the proposition that the depression is real, the horrendous guilt is real, but yet the memory is entirely, or more or less entirely, fabricated? Although we do not have to consider that what is remembered by the patient is a real event that he experienced, it clearly isn't. Even though the event was no less than fratricide, perhaps it was a memory of a fantasy involving the thought of killing his brother, the fantasy of pushing him out of the window to his death, that later gets recalled as if he had actually done the deed. We'll later consider this further when we come to consider the contributions of hauntology. But in the meantime, the troublesome conclusion here, which comes inexorably from psychoanalytic experience, is that we need to be very skeptical, not only about our patients' most vivid memories, but also our own. It's troublesome, actually profoundly troublesome, because it implies that the pillars of our system of me representations may not be so solid. Note that this is not to say, and I emphasize this is not to say, that memories are merely to be treated as untruths, even though in a sense they are, but rather that the emotional truthfulness that they convey may be far more complex than is apparent, that is, far more complex than the factual truth they seem to depict. So now we come to two intersecting processes that psychoanalysis has discovered, in which the historicity and the historicality of our representations interact in very complex ways. This gets to be very challenging to consider. These two processes open us to ways of thinking about our lived experience that are extraordinary, and both are profoundly important for the ways in which we listen to ourselves and to our patients. The two processes I'm going to briefly introduce are that of Nachträglichkeit and of hauntology. I'm calling the first one by the name Freud gave it, Nachträglichkeit, which was poorly translated in the Strachey edition of Freud's writings as after effect. It can be better, but still awkwardly translated as afterwardsness. I believe that's Jean Laplanche's suggestion. The second set of phenomena or processes has no snappy new name as far as I'm aware, but is the concern of hauntology. This refers to the way in which our present consciousness is governed not only by past events that happened and were experienced, but by lost futures, meaning by past events that did not happen. Let's go first to Nachträglichkeit. Because of the historicity of our representational system, we revise the historicality of our memories according to subsequent conditions. So the clinically most salient example is when the memory of an event that was not traumatic can subsequently traumatize the individual with the memory, sometimes long after the event. I think this will become clear in the following illustration. So here's a slightly disguised and fictionalized example, again from my Detroit practice. An uncle taking a shower and having an erection allows or even encourages his curious 2 or 3-year-old niece to play with the erection. It all seems simply playful, giggly, no big deal. And perhaps the adult rationalizes his pedophilic pleasures by telling himself that the little girl is just having a harmlessly fun, convivial, fun time. But let's leave aside the uncle for the purposes of this illustration. But indeed, at that time, the 2-year-old is simply having a giggly good time. But when the event is remembered by her, let's say 5 years later when she's 7 or 8, it becomes traumatic. She recalls liking this plaything, but she now knows that pleasure is decidedly forbidden. She also now knows what she did not know at 2 or 3 years, namely that such a large thing as an erection can go inside a woman, and that if it went inside her, it would tear her small 7-year-old body apart, etc., etc. There are many possibilities here, but you can imagine how awful such a recollection could be to a 7-year-old, not only in the terror of it, but also in the forbidden pleasure that may or may not also be recollected as having occurred when she was 2. Let's now suppose that this 7-year-old trauma has serious neurotic consequences, even if it is consciously forgotten. Let us suppose that the woman has grown up and come into treatment because she knows that she is excited by men but also finds them frightening. She's sexually inhibited. The treatment uncovers how she's racked with guilt over her erotic feelings, and so on and so on. This isn't such an uncommon clinical picture, and you can make up the details of the types of suffering that might well be the consequence of such a 7-year-old trauma. In psychoanalysis, the 7-year-old memory surfaces. I'm being very schematic here. And she realizes that after all, she was just 2 years old, and nothing happened that would seem to be so serious as to have caused her all the anguish, guilt, fear, and suffering she's endured as a result of her 7-year-old recollection of an event that occurred when she was only 2. Freud said that when traumatogenic or neurosis-causing memories are recollected in psychoanalysis, they lose their power to make us suffer. He said they crumble like the artifacts excavated from the lava-covered ruins of Pompeii, becoming dust as they are exposed to the light of day. Clinically, Freud was not a particularly adept psychoanalyst, and he sometimes tended to be graphically over-optimistic. We must understand that the 7-year-old reconstruction of the 2-year-old memory is the process of Nachtragligkeit. The shifting historicity of our representations of the past modifies drastically the significance of the historicality of particular representations. What was not a traumatic experience at 2 years becomes a traumatic memory when recalled at 7 years, with repercussions to this woman's subsequent life. The 7-year-old's suffering is the result of Nachtragligkeit, but then actually so was the adult's freedom from suffering in the course of her psychoanalytic treatment. Indeed, psychoanalysis now compels us to consider that every memory we harbor has already been modified according to these processes of Nachtragligkeit, and as they're worked through in a psychoanalytic treatment, that too is a modification according to the processes of Nachtragligkeit. Freud knew a bit about Nachtragligkeit as early as 1896, but psychoanalysts have avoided thinking too much about it until the 1950s, and even then it only really came to be taken seriously in the 1990s, and actually many practitioners have still not got their heads around the ubiquity and power of these processes. So here's the last and perhaps most provocative idea about how the past impresses itself upon the present. An idea that Freud, who was an erstwhile realist like the rest of us, does not seem to have considered. He assumed, as we all do, that past events that happened impact the present. The subdiscipline of hauntology now invites us to consider how it might be that past events that did not happen might also impact the present. The term hauntology comes from Jacques Derrida's 1993 book, Spectres of Marx, written just 4 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. You may actually recall the line in the Communist Manifesto about how there is a spectre haunting Europe, as indeed there is today. Derrida was addressing how lost futures can impact our understanding of the present, implying how much the absence of an event can be as ongoingly impactful as its presence. Notice here, we're not talking about futures as imagined, but of events in the past that might have had a future, but did not. Philosophically, this is a sort of counter-ontology, a study of the beingness of things that lack being. Hauntology is actually a remarkable and remarkably new idea, even for psychoanalysts. It points to the power of the subjunctive past, not the indicative past, over us. The subdiscipline, the deontology of hauntology, was developed by an erratically brilliant Englishman, Mark Fisher. He was a cultural critic mostly interested in the influence of what does not happen, as it is illustrated in electronic music and algorithmic simulacra. Tragically, Dr. Fisher suicided in 2017, the very year that his best book, The Weird and the Eerie, was published. There's next to no psychoanalytic literature addressing directly hauntological processes, although Sadek Rahimi's recent book, The Hauntology of Everyday Life, is interesting, as discussed in my recent review essay published in Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society. It should also be noticed that there are only a couple of theoretical paths by which we can understand hauntological processes within our psychic life. I'm not going to document them in this podcast because I think that the prior task, the immediate task, is for us to explore how they operate empirically. For some time now, I've been trying to think through the relevance of this, not only existentially, in terms of the way we think about and conduct our lives, but also clinically in terms of the way hauntological processes do indeed surface, that's probably the wrong word, in psychoanalysis. I have 5 examples, each of which I believe deserves deeper examination and further discussion. The first one is Jim Grotstein's patient. Fratricide did not happen, but the patient is haunted by it, as if it had. Second would be one of my patients whose car was stolen. In psychiatric terminology, this is a case of pseudologica fantastica or mythomania, the process wherein the patient fabricates or exaggerates, that is, lies, but then comes to experience the story as if it were genuinely true. It's actually much more common than the psychiatric literature suggests. We distort or tell untruths, and we come to believe in our concoctions. In the case of my patient, her friends, a patient again from Detroit, her friends persuaded her to tell the insurance company about the car that she had had stolen, but also to say that there had been a brand new set of golf clubs in the boot, or trunk you may prefer, even though in reality she had never played golf. And she wanted to claim on these fictitious golf clubs and get yet more money from the insurance company. But when an agent from her insurance company questioned her about these clubs, did she have a receipt? From whom were they a gift? Was she a member of a golf club? That sort of thing. My patient became righteously indignant. How dare he cast doubt on the loss of her clubs? to listen to her, one would think, and indeed this is the way it felt to me, that she had entirely lost track of the fact that these clubs never existed and their theft never happened. Third possible example. When my late father-in-law fled Russia, just before the First World War, he was escaping his adolescent exposure to pogroms in which he had witnessed tongues being torn out of Jewish mouths. However, for over a century prior to his becoming a refugee, there had actually been waves of Jews coming to the East End of London as refugees and integrating or not integrating themselves into Gentile society. This is not to make light of their plight, but it seems that many of them were fleeing persecution they had not actually experienced. I'm particularly interested in a certain sort of paranoia. I do not mean this pathologically, but a certain sort of attitude of some Jewish groups, because many of them had not witnessed pogroms, but nonetheless took up a perhaps understandably fearful position in English society. Thus, there is here a sense in which lives can be governed by events that have not actually been experienced. Perhaps this is not a good example of hauntology, particularly because there is such a thing as hearsay, and there is sometimes little or no reason not to give credence to hearsay. Fourth example. As some of you may know, my wife died over 4 years ago after our 10-year relationship. I had had a previous 10-year relationship with a woman in the United States who also died. So I have had some experience of severe mourning in that and other situations. I confess I have not read so deeply the literature on mourning, aside from making an intensive study of Freud's 1917 paper 40 years ago. So I'm not well versed in the professional literature on grief. But in my own mourning over the last 4 years, I've noticed something. Yes, there has been intense grief for the loss of the person whom I loved. Yes, there is also the usual wrestling with ambivalence. And yes, there's the painful missing of things we shared, and so on. All this has, expectably, somewhat eased over the past 4 years of the mourning process. But very recently I recognized a slightly different feeling, a new and different phase in the processing of grief, which I can only describe as grief about what might have been. Of course, I don't know what would have been, but somehow, without there being any or many specific details, there has been a feeling of loss of something that actually never was, but might have been. A fifth and final example, and I think perhaps this is the most compelling one, again from my psychoanalytic practice in Detroit. A woman terminated a pregnancy when she was 20 years old. Now in her 30s, happily married and with a young child, she's in psychoanalytic treatment with me for reasons not directly related to her motherhood. At one point in our work together, a focus arose concerning how she treated her young child. And through a lengthy exploration of various issues, we both arrived at some insights as to the ways in which her feelings and actions towards her living child were being influenced by the one that was never born. This surely is a haunting. Let's end with an intriguing line from T.S. Eliot's poem Burnt Norton, first published in 1941, but written sometime between 1909 and 1935. Here's the line. What might have been and what has been point to one end which is always present. I ask, what can Eliot mean when he says, what might have been and what has been, pointing to the always present? And is this always present something more tangible than an existential vacuum?